So chapter 9 falls in the section, we've had some, obviously, discussions of what has been reported to Paul, and then questions that the brethren in Corinth have written to him. Apparently they had sent him a letter, and we've been dealing with some of those problems after the reported problems. We're on right there with chapter 8 through 11, verse 1, really, concerning matters of meats offered to idols. A more general description could be the regulation of liberties within the life of a Christian. And JT had chapter 8 on Sunday. What was chapter 8 about when it comes down to it in regard to those liberties? What was the problem that is needing to be addressed there? Anybody? Sorry. Yes. Matter of the conscience. So there's this obviously new phase of life for people within this gospel dispensation, and it would be on both sides, Jews and Gentiles. Romans 14 has more to do with the Jewish side of things in regard to meats and whether they had a conscience that was strong enough to do it without feeling that they had wronged the Lord or anyone else, defiling their conscience. Here, primarily, the discussion concerns meats that are sacrificed to idols. Literal rendering of that concept is sacrifice meat. And there were people who had converted from idolatry, paganism, who knew that there is only one God. That was one of our questions in chapter 8. You can't be a Christian if you think that other gods exist. You've got to have that conviction that the Lord our God is one. Deuteronomy 6 records the Shema that the children of Israel said several times a day, that the Lord our God is one, and we shall love Him with all our heart, soul, and strength. That's necessary now, too, that we know there's one God, that Jesus is His Son. The Holy Spirit revealed His one Word, and you've got to have faith in that. You can't believe there are other deities. And so they know that, but here's the problem. If you've lived all your life and you've been eating these meats in a religious fashion, where you believe you're rendering obeisance and service to an idol, and now you know that that idol is fake, it's not real, but that meat is still associated in your conscience with it. And so their conscience had not caught up with their intellect. If they ate that meat, though they knew intellectually it had nothing to do with any other God, because there's only one God, it's just meat, they would have defiled their conscience because they still have that feeling, so to speak, with that spiritual service in regard to that idol. Notice in verse 13 of chapter 8, he says, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." So at the end of this section, in verse 1 of chapter 11, he'll say, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." And we'll note that that has more to do with just trying to figure out the personality of Jesus and what He may or may not have done and kind of get the feel of the Christianity. It's a pattern. And he's showing what the pattern is in regard to liberties. They are lawful, but there is potential within a certain circumstance to cause someone to stumble, and their soul would be destroyed because of that. And so Paul is saying this is the regulation that Christ has prescribed for us. You don't get to just always do what is lawful to do. You've got to weigh those circumstances. You've got to be able to see the context. It really reminds me, as we started chapter 8 with regard to the inclusion of love. You know all things, but if you don't love, you know nothing yet, as you ought to know. In Philippians chapter 1, just in your own time, go read, I believe it starts with verse 9. He's speaking about how he hopes that they would have their love abound in knowledge and discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent. And so you discern what is right and wrong, and you're going to be able to know what is loving, the loving action based on God's will. And then you go beyond that and you approve what is excellent, what's best in this circumstance. And so it's a matter of following Christ out of love to determine that this is actually lawful for me to do. But now here's this nuance where this brother or sister is going to defile their conscience if they see me eating this meat and they're emboldened to do the same. They can't in good conscience do this. Knowing their weak conscience, you're going to avoid doing what is lawful because you want to avoid causing them to stumble. So Paul is saying, imitate me in this. This is what Christ's pattern is to follow and the regulation of liberties. And we see it's a pattern because of his behavior throughout the book of Acts that we can see he takes action in, but also through the epistles. Romans 14 is a parallel to this. And here we have just the Gentile side of it, if you will. So in verse 13, when he says, I will never eat meat again, that's a big statement. And sometimes it's easier to say things than actually follow through on action. And that's really what Paul does in chapter 9 for us. He shows them that he means what he says, and he's got a track record for it. Specifically in chapter 9, what liberty is Paul going to stress that he forgoes for the sake of specifically the brethren at Corinth, but also in other places? What's that? Pay. Yeah, support as a gospel preacher, more specifically as an apostle. He has the right in putting forth this spiritual labor to receive your material things. That's his right, his liberty within the gospel. And no one can tell him that he has no right to do that. But that might hinder the gospel in this circumstance. He says down in verse 15 and verse 12 as well. And so to avoid that, he's going to forgo his liberty. There are three things that I want us to notice, really kind of main points of this whole section, 8 through 10, but even we can see them all three here in chapter 9. He's trying to avoid three things. His objective in the way he's acting is to avoid hindering the gospel, and then kind of as subpoints of that, hindering the brethren and other people as he's trying to reach them with the gospel. He's trying to avoid hindering the gospel, trying to avoid hindering his brethren and other people that he's trying to reach with the gospel, and he's trying to avoid hindering himself. And that's really where we get, starting in verse 23, going through the end of the chapter. And so there's a lot at stake here, and we need to realize that. It's not enough for us to just have knowledge. We've got to get the real thrust of the gospel. What are we doing here? We've got to know, but we've got to be convicted and have the faith that it takes to make those sacrifices. It's not about me. It's about God. I think Scott says in his prayers always that we put God first, others second, and ourselves last. And that's an excellent thought. And that's really what he's talking about here. We don't want to hinder God's will. We definitely don't want to hinder our brethren, and we certainly wouldn't want to hinder ourselves in that. And it goes even beyond, I'm gonna put myself in jeopardy, my soul in jeopardy, by causing my brother to stumble. It's also in chapter 10, we'll see, I'm getting a little too close to this. Take heed lest you fall back into idolatry, getting too close to these actions. Anything before we go on? I'll tell you right now, I'm used to not having any comments. So you raise your hand and slow me down, and we'll get through this. First of all, he defends his apostleship, and there is a defense of it. You notice he says that if I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. But what I want us to understand is that he's simply stressing that he is an apostle, and so he has the same right the other apostles have. Chapter 10, really, and 11 of 2 Corinthians is more of a defense of his apostleship. You read a book like Galatians, he definitely defends his apostleship there. He is very briefly in verses 1 and 2, but when we get to verse 3, his defense to those who examine me is this. I believe he's talking about the defense of his claim in chapter 8 and verse 13. I'll never eat meat again if that's what's at stake. He's willing to do whatever it takes to make others safe and to make sure that they have the best platform to receive the gospel. What is it that is a defense for his apostleship, though? What does he point out that we know he is an apostle by?
Miraculous gifts.
Yeah, his miraculous gifts. You have the work of the Corinthians there, and the fact that they are his seal of his apostleship in the Lord. The word seal is the Greek word sphrages, and it can mean one of four things, but all point to the metaphor. It can mean the signet that makes the impression. It can mean like the wax, the substance in which the impression is made, and then the impression itself. And all of that points toward what? What does it mean that they're the seal of his apostleship? When you put a seal on something, what do you know by that? It's official. It's certified. It's real. This has authority with it. It's true. It's got the stamp of approval, so to speak. And the seal of his apostleship with the Corinthians was what? What did they receive? Spiritual gifts. How does that happen? Apostles, Acts chapter 8. The only ones that could do that are the apostles. So he comes to Corinth, and in chapter 1 he says, you came short in no gift. And there's 9 of them enumerated in chapter 12. That's what we see in the gospel. Those 9 gifts. They came short in none of them, although they're misusing them evidently. But the way that they got those is the laying on of Paul's hands. You know more than anyone else that he is an apostle of the Lord. Not to mention who laid the foundation of Christ in Corinth. Paul, he established that church. So they should know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's an apostle. While there may be others doubting and their doubts are unsubstantiated, the Corinthians should not have any kind of doubt at all. And of course he saw Jesus, which is one of the main things that we see in Acts chapter 1 about a prerequisite of being an apostle. Then he gets into the defense of his liberty. And that's what I meant in verse 3. My defense to those who examine me is this. Depending on your translation, it may not really give an option to translate or to interpret that as what he said before is his defense. In the New King James Version, there is a colon there, and that implies what follows is his defense. I believe that's what he's saying. Here is what I mean when I say I'd be willing to forego the eating of meats off to idols. I'd be willing to never eat meat again. Prove it, Paul. Well, I'm already foregoing liberties. This is my defense. And what he does is he speaks about his right to receive support monetarily in the preaching of the gospel. And I believe this point about the right to eat and drink and the right to take along a believing wife, they fall right into that. And then he gets a little more specific with that direct connection of support in labor that you are performing. He has the right to eat and drink. Why would he say that? I think maybe our minds first go to the eating of meats, and I'm foregoing that. But he, as a preacher, as an apostle, he's got to eat, right? What does that take? Money. Where does he get that money? Well, I have the right to be supported by you. If I'm laboring in the gospel, Paul is saying, then I have a right to be paid for that so I can eat and I can feed my family. I have a right to lead about a believing wife. And he goes beyond that. Remember, he's defending his apostleship because he says the other apostles do this. He's not the only apostle. He mentions one specifically. Who's that? Cephas. He mentioned him in chapter 1, didn't he? Using him as an example of their division. That being Peter, called a rock by the Lord himself. He had a wife. We see that back in the Gospels. And then, of course, he's an elder in 1 Peter 5. And he was traveling about. He had to support his wife. She had to eat too. How's he going to do that? Support from the gospel. The brothers of the Lord are mentioned. And all he's saying is that if they can, why not me? Why am I any different? Why are you acting as if I don't have that right as well? Then he mentions Barnabas in verse 6. And he asks this question in verse 6 of chapter 9. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? What does he mean that implied by that others have a right to refrain from working? What does that mean? Refrain from working. Kind of seems to contradict other passages, right?
Secular job.
Yeah, secular job. And you hear about preachers who have to do that. They have to make tents, as we say, because Paul made tents. So that's kind of putting it right here into chapter 9. But he's not saying we have the right to not work at all, but secular work. Because work in the gospel is plenty of work. And I have a right to receive that support. But apparently Barnabas was in the same boat as him. He was willing to forego this support in other areas as well. So then he goes beyond that and he gives some everyday examples. What's the first example of really what we'll read there, quoted from the Old Testament? A worker is worthy of his wages, or that's quoted elsewhere from Jesus. But a worker is worthy of his wages is basically what he's pointing out. What's his first example? An everyday example. A soldier. Do they have to fight and train and defend the country for free? They get wages, don't they? What's the next one? Plants a vineyard. What is the the vineyard planter get? Yeah, gets to eat the grapes, gets to eat of the yield of the crop. And then lastly, the shepherd does what? Drink the milk of the flock. And everyone understands that. He's saying, look at all these everyday examples. We don't dispute that these workers are worthy of their wages. If that's right for them, why can't we understand it for us? But here are everyday examples. Now he says, do I say these things as a mere man? What does he mean by that? Is that just human wisdom? What else does he point to? The law. And so those are significant. And I think it's important to point out the logic of everyday life to people when we're trying to reach them with the gospel, but also trying to understand it ourselves. But the law is very logical as well. And it's even more powerful to see that it's authorized by Scripture. It doesn't just make sense, it's in the Word of God. And that's what he's saying. Do I say these things just as a mere man? Is that where it stops? That we see this as a truth throughout daily life? No, the law speaks about this. And what is the text that is quoted there? What is used as another example first? Yeah. And what does Deuteronomy 25:4 say? Shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. So you have the common practice of apparently threshing the wheat and grain, that's separating the chaff from the wheat, separating the actual grain from the plant, the stalk. And apparently one of the things they did, they had tools to use as well from my understanding. But a very common way of doing this was to have an ox, or even a horse at times, walk around in a circle on top of that, separating the grain from the plant. And what they didn't do, what was understood, in the law, obviously this is pointed out, but I think it was understood it was ubiquitous concept that it is inhumane, it's not right to muzzle that ox while they're working for you. They got all this food before them. Let them eat while they work. That was understood, and that was a command of the law. And it certainly was literally carried out, but what does he say next? It's about us. Is it oxen that God is concerned about? Or is it stated for our sakes? What's interesting is in Deuteronomy 24 and 25, what you're going to see maybe in your Bible has those little headings that are supplied. Mine says miscellaneous laws, because maybe some other person very much more erudite than I am could read through them and see all these connections. I don't know. We'll ask Harry when he gets back. I guarantee you he can see some connections. I'm not sure. But miscellaneous laws. But what it doesn't include is a bunch of laws about animals. What you're going to see is some laws about how you treat servants, what you do when there's even a sickness that is there. There is a particular law concerning the hired servants deserving of their wages in verses 14 through 15 in Deuteronomy 24. The fact that they're going to be poor and they need that paycheck. They're living paycheck to paycheck. When it's time to pay them, pay them. If you delay, you're wrong. The law is providing for them. And then it speaks about the harvest and how what is left over. What was the law for that? I think we're familiar with that. When you harvest the crops, what do you not do? Yeah, the corner here. You don't go back for the things that were left behind. Those are going to be for those who are needy and less fortunate. And then in verse 4 of chapter 25 is where you get to that point. All of a sudden he brings up an animal. So what's the point? Especially as we think about a hired servant is worthy of his wages. You pay him when it's time to pay him. A worker is worthy of his wages. You don't muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. So it's not simply that he's using this as a metaphor, that he's taking his liberty as an inspired apostle to use it. That's actually contextual back in the original context. He wasn't simply talking about oxen back there. He was talking about our treatment of each other. That is, of course, according to the law of Moses. He says it altogether for our sakes. If you plow, you do what? Why would anyone plow? They expect something out of it. What happens when that thing grows? they get to partake of it, right? There in 2 Timothy chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is telling Timothy to be strong in the grace of God. And one of the things he says is that a farmer must be the first to partake of his crops. And what I think he's telling Timothy there is that you've got to apply it to yourself first. You can't just be preaching for everyone else. You've got to study for yourself. You've got to live the gospel. And that's when it really becomes powerful and you can actually understand it more vividly and personally and relay it to others. And then, of course, commit it to them as well. A farmer is the first to partake of his crops. You plow with expectation. And when you harvest that, you thresh it, you make it something that can be used. You divide the grain from the crop and throw away the chaff so you can use the grain. The one who threshes partakes of that product as well. And so we plow in hope. We plow with the expectation of taking it. And so what about spiritual things? What does he say? Someone sowing spiritual things. What should they expect, or what is their right? Reap material things. Now here's something interesting. Up to this point, all of these examples have shown that the reward, the wage, if you will, directly corresponds to the labor. A soldier does a physical labor, gets physical wages. One who plants a vineyard gets the fruit of the vineyard. One who tends a flock gets the milk of the flock. Now you have someone sowing spiritual, and they are worthy to receive material wages. But there's a difference here, and it's one of emphasis on the value of the work, I believe. And that kind of will lead us to some of these questions that we have, and I'll speed up so we can maybe get there. And so if you sow the spiritual things, then is it a great thing if we reap your material things? What does he mean by saying, is it a great thing? It's really that big of a deal to receive material things? What's he saying? Yeah, is that too much to ask? This is eternal life we're talking about. This is the eternal inspired Word of God we're talking about. This is your soul we're talking about. I'm not sowing crops. I'm sowing the seed of the kingdom. And is it too much to ask for your material things? Is that just something that our minds can't comprehend? He's really driving an important point home here. And then he gives one more example. If others partake of this right, how much more me? Others had come to Corinth, preached the gospel, and evidently they had been supported. And of all people, Paul should be able to be supported as well. He gets to more examples within the law. But first he says, we don't exercise this right. And there's a reason why. What does he say? Doesn't want to hinder the gospel. What does he mean by that? How would him receiving something that is right in the line of what the gospel requires and allows, how would that hinder the gospel? Yes.
He doesn't want to give ammunition to those who would, try to bring him down. He's already he's already defended himself, and he doesn't want to give them that ammunition to say, hey, he's just doing it for the money.
Yeah. He don't want to be seen as a mercenary. I'm just in it for the money. A hired servant. I'm in it for the glory of God, the furtherance of His will, and the salvation of souls. Now, in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, he speaks about how he had robbed other churches. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 8. He's not saying across the board he's never received support from anyone. There's something in particular with the Corinthians, and he could see that this might hinder the gospel. I'm going to make sure I go to any length within my power to avoid that problem. And that's exactly what he's doing. He gives one more example. And what this example really does, also from the law, is it drives home that comparison more greatly. It's a closer corresponding principle than any other examples he mentioned before. What examples does he give? This next example.
The priests that would offer the sacrifices were allowed to eat some of the meat and other things from the sacrifice.
Yeah. There's a whole chapter of that in in Numbers 18, he speaks about it at length, that the priests and those who serve among the holy things, the Levites, the tribe of Levi, they weren't given a portion of the promised land to take, were they? Who was their portion? God was their portion. And so they work in spiritual things, in spiritual services. They're not doing some secular stuff over here. They're not tilling land. They're not, shepherding sheep and livestock, so on and so forth. They're working in the tabernacle, and they're offering the sacrifices. They're doing all the spiritual services, as we are today as spiritual priests in the holy temple, the spiritual temple. But what do they get? They are supported. And it's not benevolence. It's their portion. It's what's rightfully given them according to God's promises. And so you see kind of a greater parallel here. They're doing spiritual things, and they're receiving physical things. Anything up to that point? Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things that, unfortunately, a lot of brethren, I don't know if it's just the way they've grown up, and the way things have been done, or the way that they view it. But unfortunately, there'll be brethren out there that will view a preacher's pay as what you were talking about, the level of benevolence. And I know this is jumping ahead to a question, but yeah. I'm looking at the timing on you.
Yeah, we might as well, right?
So I'm going to go ahead and hit on this, but really, the thing is that that's not the way Paul's viewing it here. Even whenever Paul's saying that I forego this right or I didn't do it, that doesn't give ammunition to say, well, we just pay preachers only what they need. Unfortunately, that is the conversation that sometimes is had whenever a preacher comes in to work at a congregation, is the standpoint of, well, what is it that you need? And what they mean by that is how less can you take, or what's the lowest amount that you can take and be okay? And what's being pointed out here, what's pointed out throughout Scripture, I think, parallel or section you go to is 1 Timothy 5:18, is a worker is worthy of his wages. And one of the things that Paul is pointing out here is we pay these men, and we think about the soldier, we think about the one that's reaping the field, plowing the field, or all these different types of things. We pay them, and some of them get paid pretty well because of the value of the work that they do, and that's what's being pointed out here. It's not about the lowest amount that you can take and still survive. You still got to live, and you still got to, especially if you're one that's married, support your family. So what it's about is, what is the value of this individual's work? The kind of work that they are doing, how well are they doing, how well are they progressing, how hard are they working, all those kinds of things. You were talking about, we see throughout this, a lot of it is common sense, right? Or when I say common sense, a lot of it we see everyday examples. Workers worthy of his wages. This guy is doing a good work, a value, paying him worthy of that. We need to start seeing that with preachers, and I think brethren have got that confused. And also keep this in mind. We're paying, or a lot of times we talk about this pay for soldiers or others, and it's in a secular work. What kind of price tag do you put on the spiritual work that an evangelist is doing? I'm not advocating for evangelists to get paid ridiculous amounts of money, but this idea that they need to be the lowest paid member of the congregation, that's false. And that's one of the things that Paul's pointing out here. What's the value of the work that this individual is doing? That's one of the things that's being pointed out here, and that's what we need to look at in regard to these things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. He said it, not me. Scott.
I agree 100%. We're in a point where, we need more preachers, and typically anybody that's wanting to step into being preaching is doing it for the love of God, not the love of money. So on the other hand, if there was a COC, $150,000 minimum per preacher, how many preachers do you think you would see then? You know what I mean? So it's such a fine line. And I agree with what he's saying. But if, it's just tough. If it was great money, then you'd have a lot of people that shouldn't be preaching. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying what the answer is. Yes, right. I think preachers need to make more money, and we certainly need a whole lot more of them.
Yes.
Good ones,
Ryan and then Tyler.
Well, the distinction is made in 1 Timothy 5
Yeah, I think you're right. There's judgment in this. Just what came to me is similarity with our contribution. He doesn't give an exact amount. It says, as you've been prospered and you see the importance of this, who you're giving back to, and how it pales in comparison to what He's given to you. And there's a judgment there. There's not like this baseline salary for preachers or anything like that. But there's a general principle that needs to be understood. I think what a lot of times happens is people think that there's somehow virtue inherently in taking less, and that's not what Paul is saying at all. He's saying the opposite, that there is great value in preaching, and that value needs to be met with corresponding wages. But like Scott was saying, I'm doing this because I love the Lord and love the gospel, and I'm going to be willing to do what's necessary.
Yeah, and congregations want to starve them down to where they have to get a secular job.
Yeah.
Wait till you hear their lessons,
Yeah.
because there's only so many hours in the day.
Right.
There's not time to do both.
All right, he gives one more piece of evidence about this. What is it? In verse, 14. Who commanded? Here's these examples. Who commanded? Lord commanded. Those who preach the gospel should live the gospel. Where might we find that command? Yeah, 10, Matthew 10, limited commission. What did He tell them not to take with them? Money, among other things. You're going to be taken care of. So those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. All right. Next section is Paul, him being an example again, but here's where we come. He said, I don't want to hinder the gospel, but now he's also talking about the subset of that, hindering others and also hindering himself. He's going to avoid that by forgoing liberties. But first, he wants to show us why he makes that choice furthermore, kind of on a personal level. Why was Paul preaching the gospel? There you go. Why was Paul preaching the gospel? Personally, him.
He was selected by the Lord and commanded to do it.
Yeah. So if he doesn't preach the gospel, he's lost. If I never started preaching, if Harry never started preaching, that was never directly commanded us anyway. And so at this point, I can't in good conscience do anything else. I think Harry would say the same. This is what he has to do. But with Paul, from the very start, you either do it and you follow me, or you don't and you're lost. That's your option. So he had to obey the gospel, but he also had to preach the gospel. And so he's got this idea of a reward. I'm not trying to solicit your support by this. I'm giving myself as an example. In fact, I don't intend to change anything, because that would make my boasting void. It would take away some pride, so to speak, I have in what I'm doing. Because I have to preach the gospel. I have no other choice. But I can choose to do this. Scott?
There are preachers out there that if they weren't preaching, they would be kicking against the goats. I mean, it's what they're made to do.
Yeah,
And they wouldn't be happy unless they were. And thank the Lord for them.
Paul, so if he preaches willingly, he has a reward, but he is preaching by compulsion, isn't he? It doesn't mean he doesn't want to do it, but he has to do it. He has no other choice. Obviously, he loves it. Obviously, it's important to him, but he has to do it. So what's going to be his reward? What is his goal? What was that? Verse 18. What's my reward then? When I preach the gospel, what? Present it without charge. And so you've got Paul having to do this. He has a right to receive support, but he's going to take that extra step and do something he doesn't have to do, or not receive something that he has the right to receive, so that he has that platform for boasting. We might point out that idea of abusing his authority is more accurately not make full use of my right, as other translations suggest. It's not overusing something at your disposal. And that word authority, exousia, is used throughout the passage translated right. He's talking about his right. He's talking about his liberty. In fact, In chapter 8 and verse 7 or verse 9, liberty is the translation of the word exousia. So he's doing this so that he has that extra area.
I think this is just another example of Paul going to, he's showing the liberties that we have, but he is willing to go to the extreme for the sake of the gospel. In the same way that, it talks about being married, and not taking the wife, and the benefits from that, that you're able to, and I know in that context what it means, but Paul, throughout his ministry, is constantly showing that his only sole purpose is to, as much as humanly possible, not taint the gospel of Christ. And whether it be the money he takes, the way that he preaches, the trips that he goes on, the people he talks to, he is trying to make sure that in his purity that Christ is preached. And he doesn't want to have any bearing on it being tainted, even if it's not wrong.
Right.
I mean, this is a perfect example. He's saying, it's not wrong for me to take money, but if there's a possibility that I can live without it, and I know that these people aren't going to use that, I'll go without it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think something JT pointed out in his class on Sunday a couple of times was focus on the cause. What is the cause? What am I doing this for? And that goes to the greater application of this. And for us in our use of liberties, it doesn't matter if it's my right. What is the cause of the Lord? What are we trying to do here? Help each other get to heaven. If it's going to cause my brother or sister to stumble, I'm not going to do it. It doesn't matter how much of a sacrifice for me that is, how much of a thing that I've been used to in regard to exercising that liberty. I'm going to forgo that liberty. So this kind of gets to that next section of it in regard to all men. He's wanting to forgo it for the sake of the gospel. He'll talk about himself in a minute, but for all men. He's free as a member of the body of Christ. Free from sin, free from the law of Moses, free from those regulations that are not in the law of Christ. He has liberties. He has things that are allowed for him to do by the Lord himself. But what does he do, even though he's free? Makes himself a servant of all. And how does he demonstrate that? To the Jews, he what? Became a Jew. Those under the law who are Jews, he became as one who is under the law. What does that mean? And with the Gentiles as well, and with the weak.
So you mentioned it earlier in Acts 22, he did that exact same thing.
Yeah.
Went with the man, got purified. He didn't have to do, but he did it to keep the peace and everything.
Yeah.
It ended up blowing up, but
Right.
still, that's what he was willing to do.
Yeah, there was a buzz about him that wasn't true, and he was going to prove it. And he was able to do that. It was within his right to do that. He didn't have to, but he was going to do, as Tyler was saying, he's going to go above and beyond. With the Gentiles, it would be the same thing. There would be some things that you could do, something that Barnabas ended up playing the hypocrite because of Peter's example. A simple thing is eating with those who are Gentiles. You could see in Acts chapter 17 the way Paul approached the preaching of the gospel to those in Athens on Mars Hill. It was a little different than what he would do with the Jews. He's doing everything he can to make sure that he's going to win them. Then he mentions the weak. All men would just be anything you could possibly do. You read the room and you make sure you're doing everything within your power to make sure the gospel reaches them and they accept it. But what does he mean about the weak? And it's a good thing to remember. If anything, they're pretty strong spiritually because they're not going to touch this. They know that it's okay, but they can't in good conscience do it. So they're pretty strong. They're weak in conscience. We know the rest of the section. He goes on, but I want to stress that as you get into chapter 10, what he says in verses 24 through 27 is saying, not only will this hinder the gospel if I don't do it, not only will it hinder my brother, But I will be lost too if I'm going to do this and cause all of these problems. And so we need to run the race to win it. We need to discipline ourselves, go without if we can, and bring our own selves into subjection. Make ourselves our slave. We don't have to do everything we have the right to do. Not all things are expedient, as he says in chapter 10, verse 23. Thank you for your kind attention. We'll be dismissed.